Cornelius Holt threw the ledger into the dirt, not dropped it, not set it down. He threw it a full-armed swing, so the pages burst open in the dust at Elizabeth Carter's feet, like something he wanted to kill. "You think I don't know what you've been doing?" His voice didn't rise. That was the worst part. He spoke the way a man speaks when he's already decided the outcome. "Skimming from my accounts. Moving numbers around when you thought nobody was watching." Elizabeth stood in the middle of Harlan Creek's Main Street. Every shop window had a face in it. "That's not true," she said, smiled. "Who's going to believe you?" He was already turning away when he said it because he didn't need to wait for her answer. He already knew. That moment, Cornelius Holt's back walking away, while Elizabeth stood in the dust with an empty accusations hanging over her head and 8 months of her life scattered in the dirt. That moment is where this story begins. And if you've ever been the person in that street, the one who told the truth and watched it mean nothing, then you already know exactly what Elizabeth felt. Before we go further, if this kind of story speaks to you, subscribe to this channel and follow Elizabeth's journey all the way to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. It means the world to us to see how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to the beginning. Elizabeth Carter had been in Montana for 3 years before she took the job at Cornelius Holt's ranch. She hadn't come looking for work with a powerful man. She'd come looking for steadiness, a word. More than a thing that she'd been chasing since her husband, Roy, died of a fever outside of Billings and left her with $42, a mule that went lame the following spring, and no family within 400 miles. She was 34 years old. She was not soft, and she had never expected to be. But there is a difference between being tough and being alone, and Elizabeth had learned that difference the hard way, the way you learn most things that matter. She'd worked a laundry in Billings for 6 months, then moved north, with a family heading to Helena, cooking and mending for their 4 children. When that family moved on without her, not cruelly, just practically, the way frontier life worked, she found herself in Harlan Creek with a decent referent creek, with a decent skill enough with numbers that the general store owner let her run his accounts for 2 months before his brother-in-law came to town and took the position. She wasn't bitter about it. She'd stopped measuring her life by what she deserved. When the position at Holt's Ranch came open, household manager, he called it, though the actual work was closer to bookkeeper, cook's assistant, and general problem solver, Elizabeth applied with the kind of quiet practicality she brought to everything. She didn't think she'd get it. She got it. Cornelius Holt was 61 years old and built like a man who had never lost a fight because he'd always made sure the fight was fixed before it started. He owned 3,000 acres north of Harlan Creek, 2 mining claims in the hills above the valley, and the respect for fear of everyone in the county who needed anything from him, which was most of them. His wife had died 8 years earlier. His 2 grown sons were elsewhere, one in Denver, one no one quite talked about. He ran his household the way he ran his business, with an expectation of silence and an assumption that his version of events would be accepted as the only one. Elizabeth lasted 8 months. 8 months of keeping meticulous records, not because she suspected anything at first, but because careful bookkeeping was simply who she was. Roy had always said she had the mind of a bank examiner, trapped in the life of a frontier woman. She'd kept a private ledger from her 3rd week at the ranch, recording every purchase, every transaction she processed, every payment she witnessed. Not to protect herself from Holt, just because numbers that weren't written down had a way of disappearing. She learned slowly that a lot of numbers at Holt's Ranch had a way of disappearing. Not all at once. Nothing as obvious as that. A supplier invoice that didn't match the delivery. A wage payment for a ranch hand who'd left 2 months earlier. A land survey fee paid to a company Elizabeth couldn't find any record of in any register in Harlan Creek. Small things. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. Elizabeth was always paying attention. She hadn't decided what to do about it yet. That was the honest truth. She hadn't decided. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a marshal. She was a woman who needed this job and who had learned, more than once, that being right about something and being able to prove it were two entirely different challenges. She was still thinking about it when Holt called her into his study on a Tuesday afternoon in late September and told her she was fired. He did it formally, almost politely. He stood behind his desk and told her he'd discovered discrepancies in the household accounts, that certain funds had gone unaccounted for, and that, given the sensitive nature of his operations, couldn't keep someone in his employ who he couldn't fully trust. Elizabeth stood very still. "I haven't taken anything," she said. "I think you should go pack your things, Mr. Holt." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. Pressed them flat against her skirt so they wouldn't show. "I've kept records of every transaction I've handled. Everyone. If there are discrepancies, I can show you exactly where they came from." Something shifted in his face, just briefly. Just enough that she knew in the way you know things before you understand them that this was not about discrepancies. This was about the records themselves. "I'll have someone bring your wages," he said. He did not have someone bring her wages. She was escorted out by a ranch hand named Briggs, a big man with a flat affect who'd never spoken more than 4 words to her in 8 months, and he walked her to the gate with her bag and nothing else, and he didn't look at her once. She stood at the gate for a moment. The main house was visible from there, white paint, wide porch, the kind of solid permanence that money could buy on the frontier if you had enough of it. She had $40 in the bottom of her bag. She had her private ledger, which she'd taken from the desk drawer that morning, without quite knowing why. Some instinct moving her hands before her mind had caught up. She had a change of clothes and Roy's old pocket watch, which she'd kept because it was the one thing she'd never been willing to sell. She walked into Harlan Creek, and that's when Cornelius Holt made his real move. She'd been in the general store for 11 minutes. She knew, because she was watching the clock, trying to figure out if she could afford both flour and lamp oil when she heard her name. Not said to her, said about her. The kind of saying that travels through a room before the person it concerns can catch it. Holt had sent Briggs ahead of her. By the time she reached the counter, Tom Purcell, who'd run the general store for 15 years and always greeted her warmly, was looking at a spot just to the left of her face. His wife, Margaret, who'd once asked Elizabeth for her bread recipe, had found something urgent to do in the back room. "Tom," Elizabeth said, "I need to settle my account." "Your account's been settled," Tom said. Still not looking at her. "Mr. Holt paid it off this morning. Said you were." He stopped, chose a different word than whatever Briggs had used. "Said there'd been some trouble." "There hasn't been any trouble that I caused." "Elizabeth." He said her name quietly, almost gently, and that gentleness was somehow worse than if he'd accused her outright. "I think you should, maybe I think you might want to think about moving on." She bought the flour. Not because she needed it in that moment, but because she would not be chased out of a store she'd been patronizing for 8 months without completing the transaction she'd come to complete. Counted out her coins on the counter with steady hands. She was nearly to the door when it opened, and Cornelius Holt walked in. He hadn't come for anything he needed from the store. That was immediately clear. He'd come because he'd timed it, and because a man like Holt understood that public spaces were stages, and that what happened on a stage had an audience, and that audiences remembered what they saw. "Miss Carter," he said, not Elizabeth. "Miss Carter," with a particular emphasis on the miss that reminded everyone in earshot Tom. Margaret re-emerging from the back room, a woman named Addie, whose husband worked one of Holt's claims exactly what Elizabeth's position was. Unmarried, unattached. "Without protection, Mr. Holt," she said. He looked at the flower under her arm. He looked at her bag. He looked at her with the expression of a man performing patience. "I hope you'll find suitable employment," he said, "despite everything. I truly do." Despite everything did the work he'd sent it to do. She could see it landing on every face in the room. Addie's eyes dropped to the floor. Tom's jaw tightened. Margaret had gone back to the back room again, which was its own kind of answer. Kept records. Elizabeth said. She hadn't planned to say it. Came out before she'd decided to say it, the way things do when you've been holding yourself together so carefully that one thread comes loose. Holt's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Records of what? He asked pleasantly. Of every transaction I processed, every payment, every account entry. He was quiet for a moment. Well, that's interesting. He walked to the counter, spoke briefly to Tom in a low voice. Tom nodded. Holt tipped his hat to the room, smiled at Elizabeth, smiled, with his whole face, the way a man smiles when he's already won and left. Elizabeth walked out after him. That was the moment she understood fully what she was dealing with. Not just a dishonest employer. A man who moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had never once faced a consequence. She was 2 blocks down the street when she heard boots behind her and turned to find Addie Marsh, walking fast and looking at nothing. "Don't stop," Addie said quietly, pulling even with her without turning her head. Walking. Elizabeth kept walking. "He told my husband last week," Addie said, Sabine, voice barely above conversational, "that any man on his payroll whose wife is seen socializing with you will be let go." She said it flat. No judgment in her voice, just the fact of it. "He told people that before he fired me?" "Before he fired you," Addie confirmed. Elizabeth walked 3 more steps before she understood what that meant. He'd planned this, not as a response to discovering something wrong. Planned it in advance. Built the fire before he decided to light it, and whatever her ledger had shown him, whatever he'd realized she'd seen, he'd moved faster than she had. "Addie," she said. "Don't," Addie said quietly. "I have 2 kids. I'm sorry." She turned and walked the other direction. Elizabeth stood at the end of the street. The main road out of Harlan Creek ran north and south. North went deeper into the valley, toward smaller ranches and scattered homesteads. South went back toward Billings, back toward a city where she knew people. Except she didn't really know people there. Not anymore. Not after 3 years away. She had $40 minus the flour money. She had her ledger. She had Roy's watch. She turned north, not because north was better, because she couldn't make herself go south. Going south felt too much like Holt had won something that she wasn't ready to give him. She'd been walking for about an hour, maybe a little more, the flour heavy and awkward under one arm and her bag pulling at the other shoulder when the wagon came. She heard it before she saw it, the particular sound of a working wagon, not a fancy rig, wheels that needed grease, and a horse that pulled at an angle. She stepped to the side of the road, without thinking, the way you do when you've spent time on frontier roads. And you know, vehicles aren't always paying attention. The wagon slowed. She didn't look up immediately. She'd learned that looking up at stopped vehicles on a lonely road wasn't always wise for a woman alone. "Excuse me." A man's voice, not young, not old. Tired, maybe. "Are you all right?" She looked up then. The wagon was a working ranch rig, loaded in the back with fence supplies wire, posts, a toolbox strapped down with rope. The man on the bench was somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something more honest than handsome. He had a boy beside him, maybe 10 years old, who was watching Elizabeth with the unguarded curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend he wasn't looking. "I'm fine," she said. The man looked at the flour, at her bag, at the road behind her, which was empty in both directions. "You come from Harlan Creek?" he asked. "Yes." "You heading somewhere specific?" She opened her mouth to say yes, because yes was safer than the alternative. But she was tired, and tired had a way of shorting out the part of her brain that calculated what was safe to admit. "Not particularly," she said. The man was quiet for a moment. The boy beside him whispered something, and the man glanced at him, and something passed between them that Elizabeth couldn't read. "My name's William Dawson," the man said. "I've got a ranch about 4 miles up. My daughter's been alone there since this morning. I could use—" He stopped, looked at the flour again. "We've got room if you need a place to stay tonight. My housekeeper left 2 weeks ago, and I haven't. The house is in a state. I don't need charity." Elizabeth said. She said it automatically, before she thought about it, because that was the word she'd been bracing against ever since she'd left Holt's Gate. I'm not offering charity, William Dawson said. He said it without irritation, just as a correction of fact. I'm offering work. My kids need looking after, and the house needs somebody competent, and I'm running a ranch on my own. That's not charity. That's a job description. The boy beside him, Samuel, though she didn't know his name yet, was still watching her, not with pity, with something more like hope, which Elizabeth found harder to look at than pity. She looked at the road south. Then she put her flower in the back of the wagon and climbed up on the bench. William Dawson clicked at the horse, and the wagon moved. They didn't talk much for the first mile. That suited Elizabeth. She was occupied with recalibrating not just what had happened today, but what it meant for the next week, the next month, the rest of the year. She still had the ledger. She still had record of every transaction she'd processed, every irregularity she'd noticed, every number that didn't match. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with it. She knew it was the only thing she had that Cornelius Holt wanted back, and that meant it was the only thing she had that had any real value. The boy Samuel finally broke the silence. "What's in your bag?" he asked. "Samuel's," William said. "It's all right," Elizabeth said. "Change of clothes. A watch that used to belong to my husband. Some papers." Samuel considered this. "Is your husband coming later?" "He died," Elizabeth said. "A few years ago." Samuel nodded with the particular gravity of a child who has also lost someone and understands that there are some things you don't try to make better with words. "Our mother died too," he said. 2 years ago." "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said. "Papa doesn't like to talk about it," Samuel said. Then with a sideways glance at his father, "But I think he wants to." William kept his eyes on the road, but something in the set of his shoulders changed just slightly. The way a person changes when someone has said something true about them that they can't disagree with. "My sister cries sometimes at night," Samuel said. "She thinks I don't hear her, Samuel." William's voice was quiet, not sharp, just quiet. "It's okay," Samuel said. Not to Elizabeth, to his father. The way a child speaks when they're trying to take care of the adult. "She'll be okay when there's somebody there." Elizabeth didn't say anything. She watched the road ahead where the afternoon light was beginning to pull long and golden across the grass. 4 miles later, the wagon turned off the road and she saw the Dawson Ranch, for the first time a working spread, not a grand one, with a house that needed paint and a barn that was solid and several outbuildings in various states of repair. A girl was sitting on the porch steps, 8 years old, maybe 9, dark hair. She stood up when the wagon pulled in, and she saw Elizabeth, and she didn't say anything. She just looked. William helped Elizabeth down from the wagon, offered his hand, which she took without thinking about it, and then he stepped back and let the moment exist without narrating it. "That's Clara," Samuel said. "She won't say much at first. She's shy." Clara from the porch steps said, "I'm not shy. I just don't talk to strangers. This is Miss Carter," William said. "She's going to stay with us for a while." Clara considered Elizabeth with a frankness that adults usually learn to disguise. She looked at the bag, the flower, the general wear of a woman who had been walking a long road. "Did something bad happen to you?" Clara asked. "Clara," William said. "It's all right," Elizabeth said. She met the girl's eyes. "Yes, something bad happened today." Clara seemed to think about this for a moment. "Papa makes biscuits when something bad happens," she said. "He burns them usually, but it helps anyway." Elizabeth looked at William. He had the expression of a man who has been accurately and completely described by a 9-year-old and has no defense against it. "I can make biscuits," Elizabeth said. Clara stepped back from the porch steps and held the door open, and Elizabeth Carter, who had walked out of Harlan Creek with nothing but $40 and a ledger full of other people's secrets, walked into the Dawson house as the late September light fell across the valley, and the first real breath she'd taken all day finally came loose from her chest. She didn't know yet what was coming. She didn't know that the ledger in her bag was going to matter more than she'd imagined, or that the man who'd thrown her life into the dirt wasn't finished with her yet. or that the children who were watching her from doorways were going to change what the word home meant to her. She knew she wasn't safe. But for the first time since Briggs had walked her to the gate that morning, she was somewhere that didn't feel like it was trying to push her out. That was enough. For now it was enough. The biscuits burned. Not badly, not the kind of burn that meant starting over, but enough that the bottoms came out darker than they should have. And when Elizabeth set them on the table, Clara looked at them and then looked at her father with an expression that said plainly that this was an improvement on his version, but not by as much as had been hoped. "They're fine," Samuel said, and bit into one with the conviction of a boy who had eaten his father's biscuits and knew the difference. William poured coffee without being asked and set a cup near Elizabeth's side of the table without making a production of it. She noticed that. The way he moved around the kitchen, like a man who'd had to learn it late and had learned it imperfectly, but had learned it because there was no other choice. There were clean dishes in the wrong places. The flour canister was stored too far from the stove. The cast iron pan had a handle that turned. When you picked it up, the screw loose enough to be dangerous. And Elizabeth had spent the first 10 minutes after arriving quietly figuring out which way to hold it so she wouldn't dump anything. She didn't say any of that. It wasn't her kitchen. She wasn't sure yet what it was. Clara ate her biscuit in small, careful bites, watching Elizabeth the way children watch new adults, not with hostility, exactly, but with a kind of patient testing, waiting to see which version of the person was real. "You said your husband died," Clara said. "Clara." William's voice had that particular parental quality, not angry, just a warning shot. "It's all right," Elizabeth said, for the second time. That evening, she was beginning to understand that it was going to be a phrase she said often in this house. A few years ago, "How? Fever? Was it fast?" "It's a real question," Clara said to her father, with the exasperated patience of a child who has been told she asks too many questions her entire life and has not yet accepted this as a criticism. Turned back to Elizabeth, "Because Mama was fast. Papa said it was fast. I don't know if that's better or worse." Elizabeth looked at her. This small girl with dark hair and flour on her sleeve from where she'd helped or tried to help with the biscuits. Asking the question that adults spent years learning not to ask out loud. "I think it depends on the person," Elizabeth said. "Roy had a few days. He wasn't," she stopped. Found the right word. "He wasn't alone." Clara seemed to turn this over. "Okay," she said finally, and went back to her biscuit. William was looking at his coffee cup. He wasn't going to say anything, Elizabeth understood. He was the kind of man who had feelings in the way that some country has underground rivers, you could tell the water. Was there somewhere by how the land lay, but you weren't going to see it directly. Samuel, who had finished his biscuit and was eyeing the pan for a second, said, "Are you going to stay a long time?" "I don't know yet," Elizabeth said. "That depends on a lot of things." "Like what?" "Like whether I'm useful here." Samuel looked around the kitchen with a frank assessment of a 10-year-old who has been running partially wild in a household without adequate adult supervision for 2 weeks. "You're already more useful than nobody," he said, which is what we had before. William closed his eyes briefly. "Samuel, it's true. It's true," William agreed, and something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his face. "Doesn't mean you need to say it." Elizabeth did the dishes after supper, not because anyone asked her to, because she needed something to do with her hands, and because the doing of it was a way of establishing, quietly, that she was here for a reason. William dried, which surprised her. She'd half expected him to disappear to the barn, the way men sometimes did when domestic tasks were in progress. He didn't disappear. He stood beside her and dried each dish with the focused attention of a man who felt more comfortable being useful than being still. They worked in silence for a while. Outside, she could hear Samuel and Clara in the yard, some game that involved a stick and apparently a disagreement about rules. "I should tell you," William said, "that I can't pay much. Not until after the cattle drive. That's 6 weeks out." "What can you pay now?" he told her. It was less than she'd been making at Holt's, but it was something, and something was not nothing, and she'd been at nothing more than once in her life. That's fine, she said. I'm not going to pretend the house is in good shape, or that the kids are easy. Are they difficult? He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. Clara asks questions until you want to sit down, he said. Samuel breaks things. Not mean just he's 10, and he doesn't always look where his elbows are going. And they both have a hard time sleeping some nights. He paused, since their mother. Elizabeth handed him a pan to dry. How long have you been doing this alone? 2 years and some months. He dried the pan, hung it, looked at the loose screw on the handle. I need to fix that. Yes, she said. He looked at her sideways. You noticed that when you walked in, didn't you? In the first 5 minutes, he made a sound that was maybe amusement and maybe just air. My last housekeeper lasted 3 weeks. Before that, one lasted 6 days. Before that, I had my neighbor's wife helping twice a week, but her husband got sick, and he trailed off. Been a difficult stretch. A lot of people's stretches are difficult, Elizabeth said. Not dismissive. Just acknowledging the fact of it. Yeah. He set down the dried pan. What Holt did I heard some in town last week? Not details. But I knew something had gone sideways at his place. What happened? She'd expected the question. She'd been deciding for the last hour how much to answer. He accused me of taking money from his accounts, she said. Did you? She looked at him directly. No. I didn't think so, he said. But I figured I should ask. Most people didn't ask, she said. They just assumed. Most people in this county owe Holt something, William said, or are afraid of him. Sometimes both. He paused. I don't owe him anything. And I've been on the wrong side of powerful men enough times to know they're not always right just because they're powerful. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, looking at the dishwater. Kept records, she said, of my time there. Every transaction I processed. I have a ledger. She hadn't meant to tell him that yet. Or maybe she had. Maybe that was why she'd said it in the general store, too, the thread coming loose. Because she was walking around carrying something that was too heavy to carry quietly, and she needed someone to know it existed. William was still. What kind of records? The kind that show where money went that it wasn't supposed to go, she said carefully. He absorbed that, dried another plate, set it down. That's why he moved so fast, he said. That's my guess. Elizabeth. He used her first name naturally, without thinking about it, and neither of them remarked on it. If he knows you have something like that, he's not going to let it rest. I know, she said. This is a small county. I know that too. He stopped. Started again. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to say that you should probably know what you're walking around with. I've known what I was walking around with since I walked out of his gate, she said. I just haven't figured out what to do about it yet. He nodded slowly. They finished the dishes. Outside, the disagreement about stick game rules had apparently resolved itself because it had gone quiet. Some sleep, William said. The room's the second door. There's a latch on the inside that works. She noticed he mentioned the latch. Noticed that he'd thought about the fact that a woman alone in a new place would want to know that. Thank you, she said. He went out to the barn to check on the horses late, because he'd been doing dishes instead, and Elizabeth went to the room and latched the door and sat on the edge of the bed, with her bag in her lap and the ledger in her hands. She didn't open it. She already knew everything in it. She sat there instead and let herself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of the day, the ledger thrown in the dirt, Tom Purcell not looking at her face, Addie's 2 quiet words of warning before she turned and walked away, the road north, the smell of burnt biscuits, a girl asking whether dying fast was better than dying slow. She set the ledger on the nightstand, lay down without undressing, and was asleep before she'd decided to be. She woke at 5, which was her habit, and had coffee on, before she heard movement from the children's rooms. The kitchen in daylight showed her more than it had the night before. Pantry was half-stocked and haphazard a month's worth of some things, almost none of others. Someone had been buying supplies without a list, without a system, picking up whatever seemed important at the moment. The stove had a flue that needed adjustment. She could tell by the way the smoke drew. 2 of the chairs at the table had wobbly legs. She made a list in her head, not because it was her job to fix everything, but because noticing was simply what she did. She couldn't turn it off. Clara appeared first in a nightgown that was slightly too short, with her hair in the kind of tangle that suggested someone had braided it the night before without quite knowing what they were doing. "You're up," Clara said. "I'm always as up early." Clara sat down at the table and looked at the coffee, and then looked at Elizabeth with the expression of a person who is about to ask a question they already know the answer to. "Can I have some? How old are you?" "9. "Then no." Clara accepted this without argument, which suggested she'd expected it. "Papa lets me have a little." Papa probably drinks it black and thinks a little means something different than it does. Clara almost smiled. "Yeah," she said, "he does." Elizabeth poured her a small amount with mostly hot water and enough coffee to have a flavor, which was a compromise she'd made before with children, and which worked better than either refusal or capitulation. Clara wrapped her hands around the cup and seemed satisfied. "Your hair needs doing," Elizabeth said. "Papa tries," Clara said. "He's not good at it. I can see." "Don't tell him," I said, "he's not good at it. He tries really hard, and it makes him feel bad when it doesn't work." Elizabeth looked at her. This 9-year-old who was protecting her father from hearing a truth he already knew because she understood that trying mattered, even when the result was a disaster. "I won't," she said. She redid Clara's braid after breakfast. Clara sat very still, which Elizabeth recognized as the stillness of a child who was hungry for a specific kind of care and was afraid that moving wrong would make it stop. She was careful, and she took her time, and when she was done, Clara reached back and touched it once, without saying anything. The days established a rhythm the way days do when there are enough tasks to fill them. Elizabeth was not a person who needed to be managed or directed. She assessed, she prioritized, she did. The pantry was organized within the first 2 days, not so that William couldn't find anything, but so that it made sense. The flue was adjusted on the 3rd day with Samuel's help, who turned out to be genuinely useful when he was given something specific to do and when his elbows had a direction to go. The loose chair legs were glued and clamped on the 4th day, which Clara reported to her father that evening with the proprietary pride of someone who had watched an adult fix something and felt partly responsible. William came in for meals and went out again. He was not absent, he said. "Good morning." He asked how the day had been. He helped with dishes more evenings than not, but he was careful about something. Holding himself at a distance, she recognized, without being able to name immediately. On the 5th day, she understood what it was. He was being careful not to need too much, not to let himself rely on her, on any of it in case she left. The way you're careful with a cup you already know is cracked. Understood it, because she was doing the same thing. She caught herself. That 5th afternoon, looking at the kitchen, with something that was uncomfortably close to affection. The way the light came through the east window in the morning, particular sound the screen door made when Samuel let it slam, Clara's habit of leaving one shoe under the table and one by the door, and she'd pulled herself back. She was here for the short term. She was here because she had nowhere else, and because William Dawson was a decent man who'd offered a practical arrangement, not because this was her life. She reminded herself of that carefully, and then went back to chopping carrots. It was Hector who told her, on the 6th day, that Holt had been asking around. Hector Ruiz had worked the Dawson Ranch for 7 years. He was somewhere around 60, with hands that had been worked into a kind of functional sculpture and a way of standing that suggested he'd learned to be very still in situations that other men would have walked away from. He didn't talk a great deal. But on the 6th morning, when Elizabeth came out to the yard to hang laundry, and Hector was repairing a section of fence nearby, he said, without looking up from his work, "You should know that Holt's man was in town yesterday, asking people what they know about you." Elizabeth kept hanging laundry. Briggs? Different man. Somebody from outside the county by the look of him. Hector set a post. Tamped it down. Asking about where you went after you left Harlan Creek. Whether anybody'd seen you. What did people say? Some people said they didn't know. He paused. Some people probably said more. She pinned a shirt to the line. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of cold that meant winter was not far behind it, even if the days still had warmth. Does Mr. Dawson know? Not yet. Hector looked at her then briefly. I thought you should know first, so you could decide what you wanted to do. She didn't know yet what she wanted to do, but she knew she wasn't going to run again. She'd been on that road already, and she knew where it went. She told William that evening, after the children were in bed. They sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and she told him what Hector had said, and she watched his face while she did. He didn't get angry. She'd half expected anger, the territorial kind, the kind that's partly about the insult of someone poking around in your business. But what crossed his face was more complicated than that, more tired. He's going to find out you're here, Williams said. Probably already knows. Then the question is what he does about it. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Can't come onto my land without cause. He can find cause, Elizabeth said. Men like that are good at finding cause. Yeah, he was quiet for a moment. Do you want to leave? She looked at him. The question was genuine. He wasn't pushing her one way or the other. He was asking. No, she said, but I want you to understand what staying might mean. For you and the kids, I understand what it means. You don't know the details of what's in that ledger. No, he said, but I know enough. And I know Holt. He set the cup down. My father ran a small claim up in the hills when I was 12. Holt wanted the land. He found a way to question the survey, tied it up in county paperwork for 2 years, until my father didn't have the money to keep fighting. Lost the claim. Lost everything he'd put into it. He said it flatly, without drama, the way people describe losses they've had so many years to process that the anger has become something more like bedrock. So I know what kind of man he is. Elizabeth was quiet. The ledger, William said. If what you have is what you say it is, real records, real numbers, then it's not just about you anymore. Is it? No, she said. It's not. Then maybe the question isn't whether you stay. Maybe the question is what you do with what you've got. She'd been thinking about that for days. Running it through, the way she ran numbers, looking for the right sequence, the right order of operations. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a marshal. She was a woman with a ledger full of evidence that she had no formal mechanism for presenting to anyone with the authority to act on it. I need someone who knows territorial law, she said. Someone who can tell me who to bring this to and how. There's an attorney in Millfield, William said. 2 days' ride. He's not afraid of Holt. He's from outside the county. Doesn't owe him anything. His name's Aldridge. A pause. He handled my deed dispute last spring. Competent. You trust him? As much as I trust any lawyer, William said, which was an honest answer. She nodded. I need to know what I have before I know what to do with it. Whether it's enough, then we go to Millfield. She looked at him. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He said it without heat. Just a statement. The kids can stay with Hector's wife for 2 days. We go. You talk to Aldridge. We come back. He shrugged one shoulder. If Holt has a problem with me helping somebody he wronged, that's useful information. She looked at her hands flat on the table. 48 hours ago, she'd been standing in the road with everything she owned. William, she said. Don't thank me, he said. I haven't done anything yet. She almost smiled. I was going to say the chair legs should hold now, but you should still tell Samuel to stop tipping back. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. He's been tipping back in chairs since he could reach the floor, he said. Then he's about due for a consequence. Probably. They went to bed. In separate directions, in separate parts of the house, with the lamp extinguished and the kitchen going, and the sound of wind moving through the grass outside. Elizabeth lay in her room with the ledger on the nightstand and her eyes on the ceiling, and she thought about Aldridge in Millfield and Holtzman asking questions in town, and the particular look on Hector's face when he'd said, some people probably said more. She thought about Roy. Not sadly, she'd moved past the grief that made you stop, into the grief that just lived alongside you. She thought about what he would have said if he'd seen her here, in this house, with these children, and this ledger, and this man who'd offered her work when the rest of the world had offered her a direction to walk in. He would have said she was in over her head. He would have said it while handing her his pocket watch, which was what he'd always done when he meant you're going to be fine, and I believe in you, but I can't say that out loud or I'll embarrass myself. She turned onto her side. She had 6 weeks until the cattle drive. 6 weeks to figure out what she was doing with the evidence in her possession, and whether it was enough to matter, and who in this territory had the authority and the nerve to act on it. 6 weeks was not forever, but it was something. The next morning, Clara came into the kitchen with her hair already braided, not well, but attempted, with a determination that made up for some of the technical deficiency. I did it myself, Clara said. I can see that, Elizabeth said. It's a little crooked, a little, Elizabeth agreed. Can you fix the crooked part? Elizabeth turned her around and unpinned the braid and redid the last section. Clara stood still. Elizabeth, Clara said while the braid was being fixed. Are you going to stay? Actually stay. Not just for a while. Elizabeth pinned the end. Didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because what she wanted to say and what was honest were two different things, and she wasn't going to lie to a 9-year-old who was asking a question that mattered. I want to, she said finally. Clara turned around. She looked at Elizabeth for a moment with those dark eyes that missed very little. That's not the same as yes, she said. No, Elizabeth said. It's not, Clara considered. But it's not no either. No, Elizabeth said. It's not. Something settled in Clara's expression, not satisfaction exactly, but acceptance. The kind of acceptance that a child learns when they've had to practice it. She turned back to her breakfast, and Elizabeth turned back to the stove, and neither of them said anything else about it. But when Samuel came in 3 minutes later and dropped immediately into his chair at his usual angle, weight on the back legs, and Clara said, without looking up, Elizabeth says, "You're about due for a consequence." Tipping like that, Elizabeth did not correct her. She just stood at the stove and let the information land however it landed. Days moved forward. She learned the ranch. She learned the ranch. She learned the rhythm of it when William came in from the morning check, when Hector took his midday break, when the light changed over the valley in a way that meant weather coming. She learned that Samuel's breaking of things was, as William had said, purely a consequence of trajectory and velocity, and not of temper, and that the best approach was to redirect the energy into something with a better intended target. She learned that Clara's quiet was not sadness, or not only sadness, but also a kind of watchfulness, a preference for understanding things fully before she committed to them. She recognized that preference. It was her own. On the 11th day, a rider came to the gate. She was in the yard when she saw him, not Briggs, not anyone she recognized. A man in a darker coat who pulled up at the gate and looked at the house for a long moment before he called out for someone in charge. Hector was already moving toward the gate from the far fence line, and Elizabeth stayed where she was, half screened by the laundry she'd been hanging, and she watched. The man at the gate handed something to Hector, a folded paper, and said something she couldn't hear from this distance. Hector took the paper without visible reaction. The man left. Hector brought the paper to Elizabeth, not to the house. She unfolded it. It was a formal notice, signed by the county assessor's office, citing irregularities in wage records associated with Elizabeth Carter, formerly employed at the Holt Ranch Records. The notice stated that may constitute evidence in an ongoing review of employment disputes and financial discrepancies. The notice requested her presence at the assessor's office within 30 days to provide a statement. Or it said in language that had been carefully constructed to sound official, without being specific about consequences, to surrender any documents she might possess that were relevant to the matter. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. Hector was watching her. "He's using the county office," she said. "Looks like it," Hector said. "He has someone in there." "Has for years," Hector said it, without surprise. "Deputy assessor's his wife's cousin. Everybody knows it." Elizabeth looked at the gate. the road that ran past it, which ran south toward Harlan Creek and north toward Millfield. "We need to get to Aldridge before this goes any further," she said. "Yes," Hector said. She went inside. William was in the barn, and she went to get him, walking fast and not running, because running was what you did when you were afraid, and she had decided, a long time ago on a road in Montana, that she was not going to run anymore. She found him repairing a bridle. He looked up when she came in, and something in her face told him before she spoke. She held out the notice. He read it, looked up, read it again. "He's moving fast," he said. "Faster than I expected." She watched him set down the bridle. "He wants the ledger before I can do anything with it." "Then we leave for Millfield tomorrow morning," William said. "It's a 2-day ride each way." "I know what it is." He set the notice down on the workbench. "Hector can watch the place. I'll tell him what to watch for." He looked at her. "You have the ledger somewhere safe?" "It's in my room." "Keep it on you," he said. "From now on. Don't leave it in the room." She nodded. He picked up the bridle again. Not dismissively, she understood that his hands needed something to do when his mind was working through a problem. She recognized that in him by now. "William," she said. He looked up. "He's going to make it difficult for you," she said. "Whatever comes of this. He's going to make it difficult for you and the ranch and the kids. I need you to know that going in." William Dawson looked at her for a long moment. The barn was quiet around them, just the sound of the horses shifting, the creak of old wood. "Elizabeth," he said, "I've been doing difficult for 2 years." He looked back down at the bridle. "It doesn't scare me the way it used to." She stood there for another moment in the dim afternoon light of the barn, with the notice from the county assessor in her pocket and the ledger waiting in her room, and the children in the house, and this man who had offered her work when the rest of the world offered her a road to walk. She turned and went back inside to start supper. There was still tonight. There was still a meal to make, and chairs to sit in, and children who needed feeding, and ordinary things that kept happening, regardless of what Cornelius Holt put in a notice or paid a deputy assessor to signs. Ordinary things were not nothing. She'd learned that the hard way, too. She put the water on. She heard the screen door slam Samuel. Inevitably, Samuel and Clara's voice from somewhere in the back of the house, and outside the window, the valley was going golden in the late light, and Elizabeth Carter, who had arrived with nothing, and whose name was currently on a piece of official paper, designed to take the last thing she had left, stood at the stove and cooked supper. Tomorrow, Millfield. Tomorrow, Aldridge. Tomorrow, the next step. Tonight, the ordinary things that were not nothing. They left before dawn. William had the horses ready by 4:30, which told Elizabeth he hadn't slept much either. She came out of the house with the ledger inside her coat against her ribs, where she could feel it with every breath, and her bag over one shoulder, and found him checking the cinch on the second horse with the focused quietness of a man running through a list in his head. Hector was there too, standing at the edge of the yard in the dark, which she hadn't expected. "Kids are still asleep," Hector said. "My wife will be here by 6. You explain to her." "She doesn't need explaining," he said. "She'll look after them." Elizabeth nodded. She'd met Rosa Ruiz, twice a compact, direct woman who had shaken Elizabeth's hand the way men shake hands, without fussiness, and who had looked at the state of the Dawson kitchen with an expression that confirmed everything Elizabeth had already assessed. "If anyone comes to the gate," William said to Hector. "I know," Hector said. "Don't let them pass the gate without." William. Hector said his name the way you say it to someone who is repeating instructions you already have. "I've worked this ranch for 7 years." "Go!" William looked at him for a moment. Then he put his foot in the stirrup and mounted. Elizabeth did the same. Less smoothly she could ride. She'd ridden most of her life. But it had been a while, and the horse was unfamiliar, and there was a graceless moment she chose not to think about. They rode out in the dark without speaking. The road to Millfield ran north and then east through a long stretch of open valley before it climbed into foothills where the trees thickened and the road narrowed, and you couldn't move fast. In the dark, in the cold, with stars still out, and the first suggestion of gray Not yet touching the eastern edge of the sky, Elizabeth rode with her hand pressed occasionally to her coat, checking the ledger the way you check something you cannot afford to lose. After about a mile, William said, "You warm enough?" "Yes," she said. They rode another half-mile. "You're not going to talk much, are you?" he said, not accusatory. "Just noting I'm thinking," she said. "What about?" "Aldridge. What to show him first? What order to present things in?" She watched the road ahead. "If he looks at it and tells me it's not enough, I need to know what more would make it enough. And if he tells me it is enough, I need to know who he takes it to and how long that takes, and whether the county assessor's notice changes anything about the timing." William was quiet for a moment. "You've been running this since last night." "Since the notice came," she said. "Yes, you do that a lot. Run things." "It's how I think," she said. "Is that a problem?" "No," he says. "My wife used to say I never thought far enough ahead, said I was good at starting things and bad at imagining consequences." He said it without particular sadness, just as a fact about a person he'd known well. Maybe it balances out. Elizabeth glanced at him in the gray dark. "What was her name?" "Margaret," he said. "Maggie." "How did you meet?" It was a forward question, and she knew it. She asked it anyway, because they had 2 days of riding ahead of them, and because she was tired of the careful distance they'd both been maintaining, and because, practically speaking, if Holt was going to make things difficult for William, on account of her, William deserved to be talking to a person he actually knew something about. "She came out from Illinois with her sister's family," he said. "Came to help with the sister's new baby. Then the sister's husband got an offer on land up near the Canadian border, so they moved on, and Maggie had to decide whether she was going with them or staying." He paused. She stayed. She said later she stayed because she'd seen the valley and she didn't want to leave it. Another pause. "I don't know if that's the whole story. Do you think there was more to it? I think she also didn't want to spend another winter sleeping in the same room as her sister and 3 children, and an infant," he said, and Elizabeth laughed, a real one, surprised out of her, because she hadn't expected it. He looked at her with something that was close to relief, like he'd been trying to land that and wasn't sure he had. "How did Roy come to Montana?" he asked. "He followed a man he worked for in Missouri," she said. "Cattle work. The man moved his operation up here, and Roy came with it, and then the man sold the operation 2 years later, and Roy stayed because he'd already decided he liked it." She looked at the road. "He always said the light was different here. That was his reason for everything. The light." "He wasn't wrong," William said. "No," she said. "He wasn't." They rode in the gray early morning, and the sky ahead of them gradually lightened, and the valley opened up to the east in the way it did, wide and clear, and the kind of beautiful that was almost too functional to be called beautiful, like a working tool that happened to be made perfectly. They made good time through the valley. The foothills slowed them, as she'd expected. The road wound and the horses picked their way, and by midday they'd covered maybe 2/3 of the distance. Stopped at a creek to water the horses and eat the food Rosa had apparently left in William's saddlebag cornbread and dried meat and 2 apples, packed with more care than could have been assembled that morning before 6. "Rosa knew we'd need this before you asked her," Elizabeth said. "Rosa generally knows things before you ask her," William said. "It's how she is." Elizabeth sat on a flat rock beside the creek and ate her cornbread and thought about the ledger against her ribs and the notice in her coat pocket and the fact that Cornelius Holt had managed, in 11 days, to move from firing her to marshaling county resources against her, which was either the behavior of a man covering something serious or the behavior of a man so accustomed to crushing problems that he couldn't stop himself even when restraint would have served him better. She was beginning to think it was both. "There's something I haven't told you," she said. William looked at her. He'd learned, she thought, that when she said something like that, it was worth waiting for. "In the ledger," she said, "there are entries for a company called Merritt Land and Survey. Payments going out from Holt's accounts over 18 months. Significant amounts more than a legitimate survey operation would charge. I couldn't find any record of Merritt Land and Survey existing as a registered company anywhere in the county. He was paying himself, William said, immediately, like he'd been waiting for exactly that shape of information. That's what I think, she said. Creating a fake company, running his own ranch and mining money through it, then taking a cut. She paused. But it's worse than that, because some of the payments from Merit Land and Survey aren't going back to Holt. They're going somewhere else. Somewhere I couldn't track from what I had access to. William was very still. There's another person, he said. Or multiple, she said. Someone with enough standing that Holt was paying them. Regularly. Over 18 months. Someone in the county, William said slowly. That's my guess. Someone who was doing something for him. Clearing paperwork. Adjusting records. She looked at the creek. Maybe someone in an official position. She watched it land. Watched him work through it. The deputy assessor. His wife's cousin. Holt's man in the county office, Hector, had said it without surprise, because everyone in the county already knew it. But knowing it informally and having it in a ledger were different things. That's in there, William said carefully. And it's clear. It's in there, she said. Whether it's clear enough for Aldridge to act on is a different question. They were both quiet. For a moment, the creek moving past them, the horses standing in the water with the patient relief of animals that have been working. This is bigger than I thought, William said. Not accusingly, just settling the new shape of things. Yes, she said. I'm sorry, I should have told you sooner. Would it have changed whether you told me to take you to Millfield? She thought about it, honestly. I don't know. It wouldn't have, he said. So don't be sorry. They mounted and rode the last stretch to Millfield in the early afternoon. Arriving as the sun was at its lowest useful angle, long shadows stretching across the main street of a town that was larger than Harlan Creek. 2 streets wide, with a proper bank and a dry goods operation that had glass in the windows, and a small courthouse set back from the road, with a territorial flag hanging limp in the still air. Aldridge's office was above the bank. They left the horses at the livery and climbed a narrow stair and knocked on a door with a hand-lettered sign that said, Thomas Aldridge, attorney at law, and waited. The man who opened the door was younger than Elizabeth had expected, maybe 50, lean, with the slightly rumpled quality of someone who lived more in documents than in the world. He looked at William, then at Elizabeth, then at William again. William Dawson, he said. It's been a while, it has, William said. This is Elizabeth Carter. She has something you need to look at. Aldridge looked at Elizabeth, at the way she was standing, not deferential, not aggressive, just waiting, the patience of someone who has prepared for this. Come in, he said. The office was what she'd expected, stacked files, a desk under siege, 2 chairs that didn't match, facing a 3rd chair that was clearly his. She sat in one of the mismatched chairs without waiting to be invited and took the ledger from inside her coat and set it on the desk. Aldridge looked at it, then at her. May I? That's why we're here, she said. He opened it. The next 40 minutes were the strangest of Elizabeth's recent life, which was saying something given the competition. She sat in the chair and watched a man read her own records she'd kept in her own hand over 8 months. In a ledger she'd bought with her own wages and carried in her own coat since the day she'd walked out of Holt's Gate. She watched his face. Aldridge had a lawyer's face, mostly controlled, but there were moments. A tightening around the eyes when he reached the Merit Land and Survey entries. Slight pause, a page turned back, a comparison of 2 pages he'd apparently needed to see side by side. William sat in the other chair and said nothing. She was grateful for that. When Aldridge finished, he closed the ledger and placed it carefully back on the desk and looked at Elizabeth. How long did you work for Holt? He asked. 8 months. And you kept this, he touched the ledger, throughout, from the 3rd week. Did anyone know you were keeping it? No, Holt? He found out when he fired me, or he suspected. I think seeing me with my bag already packed convinced him I'd taken something. But you hadn't taken the ledger from him. It's yours. I bought it. In town. I used it for all the household record keeping as a personal backup, which was my normal practice. There's nothing in it that wasn't already in his official accounts, but his official accounts don't show the entries the the way mine do. Mine show the pattern. Aldridge nodded slowly. He looked at the ledger again, not opening it, just resting his hand on the cover the way you rest your hand on something when you're thinking about its weight. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need you to answer honestly. I always do, she said. The Merit Land and Survey entries. You believe those payments represent fraud. Specifically, that Holt constructed a fictitious company to siphon money from his own operation and distribute it to someone in a position to benefit him officially. He looked at her. But you don't know that with certainty. No, she said. I know what the ledger shows. I know what I couldn't find when I looked. I know the amounts don't match any legitimate surveying operation. The interpretation, she paused. That's what I'm hoping you can do. Aldridge almost smiled. Just the edge of one. Where did you learn to keep books like this? My father, she said. He ran a general store in Ohio. I kept his accounts from the time I was 12 until I left. He taught you well. He taught me that the numbers always tell the truth if you let them. People lie. Numbers, don't they just get moved around? But if you keep your own record of where they started, you can always see where they went. Aldridge looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at William. The county assessor's notice, he said. She mentioned it on the way up? She showed me, William said. It's not legally binding, Aldridge said. Not the way it's written. He's using the office to apply pressure, but the language is carefully vague surrender. Any documents you might possess is not an order. Phrased as a request dressed in official clothing. He tapped the desk once. However, if he escalates to a proper subpoena, that changes things. The question is how quickly he moves. He moves fast, Elizabeth said. He had someone in Harlan Creek asking about me within 5 days of firing me. The assessor's notice came on day 11. Then he knows you have something. He just doesn't know how much. Aldridge paused, which means we need to move faster than he does. He stood up, which seemed to be a decision rather than a movement. I need 3 days. I need to look at the territorial statutes on fraudulent land surveying operations and compare them against what you have here. And I need to write to a colleague in the capital who handles this class of case. He looked at Elizabeth. Can you leave this with me? She looked at the ledger, thought about carrying it for 11 days pressed against her ribs. Make copies first, she said. Tonight, before I leave this office. Aldridge nodded. I have a copy press. It'll take a couple of hours. Then we'll wait, she said. They waited. William went down the street and came back with food from a restaurant, actual restaurant food, which Elizabeth had not had in weeks, and which tasted extraordinary in the way that ordinary things taste extraordinary when you've been running on worry. They sat in Aldridge's office, while the man and his clerk worked the copy press, and Elizabeth ate and William ate, and the light outside went golden, and then purple, and then dark. By 9 o'clock, she had the original ledger back in her coat, pressed against her ribs where she could feel it. Aldridge had 3 pressed copies locked in his safe. 3 days, he said again, at the door. I'll send a rider to Dawson's Ranch when I have something. Don't come back to Millfield unless I send for you if Holt has someone watching. You don't want to be seen making regular trips here. Do you think he has someone watching? Elizabeth asked. I think he has someone's everywhere, Aldridge said. He's been building this county for 30 years. You don't do that without coverage. He looked at her steadily. What you've done, Miss Carter, keeping records the way you kept them, not destroying them, not losing your nerve on that road that matters. What you have is real. I need 3 days to confirm how real and to whom we take it. That's not me being cautious. That's me being thorough enough that when we move once and we move right. She nodded. She put her hand out and he shook it. They stayed the night at the Millfield boarding house, separate rooms, the matron noting their arrival with the particular attention. Frontier women paid to arrangements that weren't immediately categorizable, and Elizabeth finding she had no energy left to care about what conclusions were drawn. She lay in the boarding house room and thought about nothing for a while, which was a relief. Then she thought about Ruth. The name had come up once in the ledger not as a payee, not as part of any transaction, But as a notation, Elizabeth had made in the margin 3 months into her employment, next to a payment she couldn't track. A name she'd heard Holt use once, on the telephone at the county office, when he didn't know she was in the adjacent room, and she hadn't been able to catch more than one word in 3. Ruth, said in a tone that was not quite business, not quite social either, the tone of someone who has a complicated arrangement with someone they cannot entirely control. She hadn't put it together then. She was putting it together now. She fell asleep with her hand on the ledger and woke at 5, which was her habit, dressed in the dark, and went to find William already downstairs, with coffee in a chipped cup, sitting at the boarding house table with his hat on the bench beside him and his eyes on the window. Ready, she said. Been ready, he said. They rode back. The return was faster. Somehow the road familiar now, the horses knowing the direction, the conversation easier in the way that 2 days of travel together makes conversation easier. They talked about the ranch, about the cattle drive, about Samuel's habit of breaking things, and Clara's braidwork, and Hector's wife's cooking, which William rated above his own without any apparent self-consciousness. They were an hour from the ranch when William said, without particular preface, "Maggie would have liked you." Elizabeth looked at him. He was watching the road. She liked people who didn't waste words, who knew what they were doing and just did it. A pause. She would have had opinions about your bread, though. She had opinions about everyone's bread. Was she a good cook? She was a confident cook, he said, which isn't always the same thing. Elizabeth thought about that. Roy was the same. He'd serve you something with complete conviction, and you'd eat it because you couldn't argue with how sure he was about it. That's exactly it, William said. They rode in comfortable quiet for a while. When this is done, William said, and she noticed he said, not if when Aldridge has done what he needs to do, and this goes where it needs to go. What do you want to do? She looked at the valley opening up ahead of them. The Dawson Ranch was somewhere in it, invisible at this distance, but there she knew exactly where it was now. Could feel it in the landscape the way you start to feel a place when you've been in it long enough. I don't know, she said. I haven't let myself think about after. Maybe you should start. She didn't answer that. They came around the last bend, and the ranch appeared in the middle distance, and something settled in Elizabeth's chest that she did not immediately examine. Hector was at the fence line. Rose's horse was still at the post by the house. 2 small figures were visible in the yard, which meant the children were out, which meant things were normal, which meant the 4 days she'd been holding. Her breath could finally exhale. Then she saw the second wagon at the gate. It wasn't Holt's livery rig, she'd know that on sight. It was a smaller, older wagon, a woman's wagon, the kind with a canvas cover tied down on both sides, pulled off to the side of the gate as if it had been there a while. Who is that? William said. I don't know, Elizabeth said, but Hector does. Hector was walking toward them from the fence line, moving, with a purpose that was not urgency, but was not casual either. Woman came yesterday afternoon, Hector said, when he reached them. Said she needed to speak to Miss Carter. Wouldn't say who she was or what about. I didn't let her pass the gate. Elizabeth looked at the wagon. Someone was sitting in it. She could see the shape of a figure under the canvas cover's shadow. A woman, older, sitting very still. She's been there since yesterday? William said. She came back this morning, Hector said. Left and came back. Elizabeth looked at Hector. You didn't recognize her? She gave me a name. He paused. She said her name was Ruth Holt. The name sat in the morning air. Elizabeth was off her horse before she'd decided to be. She walked to the gate. The woman in the wagon watched her come. She was somewhere in her mid-60s, with a face that had been handsome once, and was still composedly, the kind of composed that looked like it had been maintained through considerable effort over considerable time. Clothes were decent but not fine. The wagon was hers, clearly packed with what looked like a household, covered and tied. She looked at Elizabeth the way a person looks at someone they've been thinking about for a long time. Miss Carter, she said. Mrs. Holt, Elizabeth said. Ruth, the woman said. I haven't used the other name in 15 years. Elizabeth looked at her, looked at the packed wagon, looked at the woman's hands on the reins steady, but not easy. You left him, Elizabeth said. I left him 15 years ago, Ruth said, but it took me until 3 days ago to actually leave. She said it without self-pity, just as an accurate description of a complicated timeline. When Briggs came to the house and told Cornelius you'd turned up at the Dawson place, when I heard him on the telephone talking about the assessor's notice, she stopped. I know what's in that ledger, or I know some of it, because I was there when most of it started. Elizabeth was very still. I didn't participate, Ruth said quickly, with the quickness of someone who has been preparing that sentence for a while. I want to be clear about that. I didn't help him, but I knew, and I kept quiet because I was afraid, and because leaving seemed impossible, and because she stopped again, looked at her hands. It doesn't matter why. What matters is what I know, and what I know is everything he built, and every person who helped him build it, including the ones whose names are in that ledger and the ones whose names aren't. Elizabeth stood at the gate. Behind her, she could hear William walking up, and Hector, and somewhere farther back, the sound of Samuel's voice asking Rosa something that Rosa answered in quick Spanish. Why come to me? Elizabeth asked. Ruth looked at her. Because you're the only person in this county who has fought him and isn't dead or ruined, she said. Not yet. A pause. And because I should have done this 10 years ago and I didn't, and I can't carry it anymore. She said the last part flatly, like a woman reading from a list. I have names. I have dates. I have letters he wrote. Letters I kept because I knew someday I was going to need them. And I have an account at the Millfield Savings Bank in my own name that Cornelius doesn't know about, which means I'm not coming to you because I need rescue. She met Elizabeth's eyes. I'm coming to you because you need what I have. Elizabeth looked at this woman who had driven 2 days to find her and waited at a gate since yesterday and come back and waited some more. She looked back at William. He gave her nothing, no direction, no expression that told her what to do. It was her decision. He was simply there, which was, she was beginning to understand what he did. He was simply, consistently there. She turned back to Ruth Holt. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee. Ruth climbed down from the wagon with the stiffness of a woman who'd been sitting in it for 2 days, and Elizabeth opened the gate, and they walked up toward the house, together, 2 women who had both spent years in the radius of the same man's power, walking toward the same kitchen, toward the same question of what came next. Clara was on the porch. She watched Ruth with the usual assessment. Then she looked at Elizabeth. Is she staying too? Clara asked. For a while, Elizabeth said. Clara looked at Ruth again, at the wagon, at the general shape of someone who'd been traveling hard. I'll get another cup, she said, and went inside. Elizabeth watched her go, felt something move in her chest that she still didn't have the right word. For not quite pride, not quite love, not quite either of those things by themselves. She held the door open for Ruth Holt. The kitchen was warm. Rosa had kept the stove going. The coffee was already on, because Rosa had somehow known the way Rosa seemed to know things. Elizabeth set the ledger on the table. Ruth sat down across from it and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. I kept records too, Ruth said finally. Different kind. But records. Where are they? Elizabeth asked. Somewhere safe, Ruth said. I'll take you to them when I trust you enough. Fair, Elizabeth said. Poured the coffee. Outside, the valley was clear and cold, and the morning light was moving across the grass the way Roy had always said it did different from anywhere else the way it fell. Somewhere in the house a chair scraped. Samuel probably, his elbows moving through the world. Elizabeth sat down at the table. There was work to do. Ruth trusted her on the 4th day. Not all at once. Not with a speech or a ceremony. She simply came down to breakfast, sat across from Elizabeth, set a flat tin box on the table between them, and said, the letters are in there. The account records are underneath. Elizabeth looked at the box, then at Ruth. I thought about leaving last night, Ruth said. She said it like she was reporting weather. Packed my bag back up. Sat on the edge of the bed for about an hour. She picked up her coffee cup. Then I unpacked it. What changed your mind? Ruth looked toward the window, where the early light was coming in at the angle Elizabeth had come to recognize as belonging specifically to this kitchen, this house, this particular place in the valley. Clara came and knocked on my door. At about 10 o'clock, she said. Said she thought she'd heard me moving around and wanted to make sure I wasn't sick. She paused. 9 years old. Elizabeth said nothing. Nobody's checked on me at 10 o'clock at night in a very long time, Ruth said, and left it there. Elizabeth opened the tin box. The letters were bound with a piece of twine, maybe 30 of them, written on Holt's personal stationery. She recognized the letterhead immediately, had filed enough of his correspondence to know the exact shade of cream paper he used, the slightly pretentious engraved border. But these weren't business letters. They were written to a man named Gerald Fitch, and they were specific in ways that made Elizabeth's hands go still as she read. Fitch was the deputy assessor, Holt's wife's cousin. The man everyone in the county knew was in Holt's pocket, but nobody had been able to prove because knowing something and having it in writing were two different countries. The letters didn't use plain language. Holt was too careful for that, but they were detailed about favors, about timing, about survey filings that needed to move faster or slower depending on which parcels were involved. About one specific parcel, a homestead claim on the North Ridge, filed by a family named Pearson 3 years ago that needed to disappear from the active registry. About payments that would follow the disappearance. The Pearson family had lost their claim. Elizabeth knew this because Holt had mentioned it once, offhandedly, the way powerful men mention the outcomes of things they've arranged, as evidence of how the world works, not as something to be questioned. She hadn't thought much about it at the time. She was thinking about it now. Persons, Elizabeth said. They moved to Oregon, Ruth said, 2 years ago, after the claim went through. Or didn't go through, rather. She set her cup down. There were others. The Persons are just the ones I remember, because their youngest daughter was about Clara's age, and she used to come into town with her mother, and Cornelius would see them, and not even. She stopped. He didn't even register them as people, that's the part. I couldn't. She stopped again. I'm not looking for absolution. I'm just telling you what I know. I know you're not, Elizabeth said. She read 3 more letters. Then she set them down and looked at the account, records a separate ledger, thinner than hers, in Ruth's handwriting, which was precise and small, and had the quality of someone who had learned to write in a way that took up as little space as possible. The records went back 11 years. Not all of them were damning on their own. Some were simply documentation of the household purchases, accounts, expenses that Ruth had tracked with the particular vigilance of a woman who understood that financial information was a form of safety. But threaded through the ordinary household records were entries that matched exactly certain outflows in Elizabeth's own ledger, payments that had left Holt's ranch accounts and appeared 3 steps removed, in places Ruth had traced with quiet patience over 11 years. You've been building this since I understood what he was, Ruth said. Yes. Elizabeth looked up. Why didn't you take this to someone years ago? Ruth met her eyes. Who, she said simply. The county assessor? The man in Harlan Creek who he put there? Territorial Marshal's office, which is 200 miles away, and to which a woman with no legal standing and no corroborating evidence is going to walk in and say my husband is corrupt. And they're going to ask her why she stayed. And she's going to say because she was afraid. And they're going to look at her the way men look at women who stayed. She said it without bitterness. Just the flat geography of it. I needed corroboration. I needed someone else's records. Something that wasn't just the word of a wife who might have any number of reasons for wanting to damage her husband. She looked at Elizabeth's ledger, sitting on the other end of the table. I needed that. Elizabeth sat with that for a moment. 2 women, 2 sets of records. One kept from the inside over 11 years, one from the outsides over 8 months. Neither complete on its own. Together they made something that was not a guess or a complaint or a wife's grievance, or a fired employee's revenge. Together they made a case. She went to find William. He was in the barn doing the morning feed, which was where he was every morning at this hour. Not because he needed to be. Hector managed the horses well enough. But because William Dawson was a man who needed to do the morning feed, the way some people need to make their bed, a physical act that established the day as started, as real as his. She told him what was in the tin box. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was his particular way of paying attention, full, patient, with no visible effort to get ahead of what you were saying. When she finished, he set down the feed bucket. "Aldridge needs to see this today," he said. "I know, not in 3 days. Today." "I know," she said again. "I'm going to ride to Millfield this morning. I'm coming with you." "William, I'm coming with you," he said. Not louder, just clearer. "Ruth can stay with the kids. Hector's here." He looked at her. "You're not riding to Millfield alone with that much material in your saddlebag. That's not stubbornness on my part. That's just arithmetic." She wanted to argue. She looked at his face and found no opening for an argument that was actually about the argument, rather than about something else she wasn't ready to say. "Fine," she said. "Good." He picked up the bucket again. "Give me 20 minutes. She went back to the house. Ruth was still at the table, her hands around her coffee cup, watching the kitchen with an expression that was hard to read, not lost exactly, but unmoored. The look of a person who has made a large, irreversible decision and is only now beginning to feel the shape of it. "We're going to Millfield," Elizabeth said. "Today. I want to take both ledgers and the letters." Ruth nodded. Then, after a moment, "I want to come." Elizabeth looked at her. "I know," Ruth said. "I know it's simpler if I stay here. I know I complicate things if I'm there a wife testifying against her husband. People are going to have opinions about motivation. I know all of that." She looked at Elizabeth steadily. "But I've been sitting with this for 11 years. I want to be in the room when someone with the authority to do something about it reads those letters." Elizabeth thought about it for 4 seconds. "Get your coat," she said. They rode to Millfield in 3 hours, pushing harder than the first trip, and arrived at Aldridge's office before noon, to find the man already at his desk, with a letter in his hand, and the particular expression of someone who has just received information that has rearranged what they thought they knew. He looked up when they came in, looked at Ruth, looked at the tin box under Elizabeth's arm. "I was about to send for you," he said. "What happened?" William said. Aldridge set down the letter. "My colleague in the capital. He wrote back faster than I expected." He looked at Elizabeth. The Merritt Land and Survey Company was registered, not in this territory, in Wyoming 3 years ago, under a different name, but the registered agent is a man named Casper Holt, Cornelius's younger brother. The room was quiet for a moment. "He brought family in," William said. "It's not unusual for this class of fraud," Aldridge said. "You move the company across a territorial line. The name changes. The trail gets harder to follow. The money still flows." He looked at Elizabeth. "What you have in your ledger, the merit payments, they're not just local corruption. They're potentially territorial, which means the territorial marshal's office has jurisdiction, not the county assessor. Which means Fitch can't touch it," Elizabeth said. "Fitch has no authority over a territorial matter. None." Aldridge leaned forward. "Miss Carter, what did you bring me?" She set the tin box on his desk. "Ruth Holt," she said, "who kept records for 11 years. Aldridge looked at Ruth. Ruth sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited, which was, Elizabeth had noticed, what Ruth did. She'd spent so many years making herself small that the parts of her that weren't small had apparently been waiting with considerable patience. "I have letters," Ruth said, "between my husband and Gerald Fitch. Specific instructions about specific land filings, and account records going back 11 years, showing where money moved and where it went." She set her hands flat on the desk. "I'm prepared to make a formal statement. I understand what that means legally. I've had 11 years to understand it." Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. You understand that your statement will be used in proceedings that could result in criminal charges against your husband. I understand. That's the point, Ruth said. And you understand that his attorneys and he'll have attorneys will question your motivation. Estranged wife, contested property, personal grievance. I understand that too, Ruth said. That's why you need both of us. She nodded toward Elizabeth. Her records aren't a wife's word. They're an independent bookkeeper's documentation. Mine fill in what hers can't see. Together, they're not a grievance. They're a record. Aldridge was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at William, as if seeking the perspective of the only person in the room who didn't have a personal stake in the outcome. She's right, William said. Aldridge picked up a pen. I'm going to need the rest of the day, he said, and possibly tomorrow. I need to write to the territorial marshal's office tonight. I have a contact there, a man named Garrett, who is neither corrupt nor politically entangled in this county because he isn't from this county. He looked around the room. Can you stay in Millfield tonight? Yes, Elizabeth said. Then I need you all to come back tomorrow morning. I want formal statements from both of you before I send anything to Garrett. Because once I send it, this moves out of my hands and into the marshal's, and at that point, the clock is running. He looked at Elizabeth. Holt is going to know. Maybe not immediately, but he'll know. And when he knows, he's going to react. He always reacts, Elizabeth said. It's not new. This will be different, Aldridge said. Before he was managing a problem, a fired employee, a bad document, a small threat. When the territorial marshal contacts him, when he realizes it's not just you anymore, he paused. Men like Holt don't process that well. No, Ruth said quietly. They don't. They went back to the boarding house. Different rooms from the first trip, the same matron, who noted their return with even more focused attention than before, apparently reassessing her earlier conclusions in light of the group's expanded composition. That evening, the four of them ate supper at the boarding house table. Elizabeth, William, Ruth, and an uneasy quiet that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, just waited. Ruth ate without talking much. William ate the same way. Elizabeth found herself watching them both and thinking about the particular quality of people who communicate in non-performance, who do not fill silences because they feel obliged to, who are simply present in whatever room they're in. After supper, Ruth went to her room early. Elizabeth sat with William in the small front room of the boarding house, which had 2 chairs and a lamp and a view of the dark street. She was tired in a way that was different from exhaustion, not physical, exactly, but the tiredness of carrying something heavy at altitude. Aldridge is good, William said after a while. Yes, she said. Trust him? As much as I trust any lawyer, she said, which was what he'd said about Aldridge the first time, and she said it the same way, and he recognized it, and the corner of his mouth moved. He sat for another moment. After the statements tomorrow, William said, when Aldridge sends to Garrett, what happens to the ranch in the meantime? If Holt reacts the way Aldridge thinks he might, we go home and we wait, Elizabeth said, and we make sure what we have is documented and copied and in Aldridge's safe and in the mail to Garrett, so that anything Holt does to the ranch or to us after that date makes him look like what he is. Which is what? A man who knows he's losing, she said. William looked at her. In the lamplight, he looked like what he was, a tired man, a working man, someone who had signed up for considerably more than he'd expected when he'd stopped a wagon on a road outside Harlan Creek and offered a woman a job. I'm sorry, Elizabeth said, for what this has become. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm saying it because it's true. She looked at her hands. You stopped to help someone you didn't know, and now you're sitting in a boarding house in Millfield because a corrupt landowner with a 30-year grip on the county is going to find out in the next week that his empire is coming down, and the last known address anyone can trace that news to is your ranch. Elizabeth, William said, I'm serious. So am I. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on his knees. You know what I was before you came? I was a man who burned biscuits and let his daughter braid her own hair and spent every evening trying not to think about how quiet the house was. He said it without drama. I'm not sorry for any of this. I'm just, he stopped. Found something. I'd rather be in it than out of it. Whatever it is. She looked at him. That's a very inconvenient thing to say, she said. He agreed. Probably. They went to their separate rooms. Elizabeth lay in the dark and thought about what Aldridge had said, once I send it, this moves out of my hands, and what that meant. Practically the coming days. Holt would know. Holt would react. And between the moment he knew and the moment Garrett arrived with authority to do something about it, there would be a window. A stretch of time in which Cornelius Holt still had influence and resources, and the particular recklessness of a man who had never faced a real consequence and could not yet believe that was actually changing. Fell asleep, thinking about the window. They gave their statements in the morning. Elizabeth's took 2 hours. She sat across from Aldridge and his clerk and went through the ledger entry by entry, explaining each one, explaining its significance, explaining what it showed in isolation and what it showed in combination with the entries around it. She had thought about this for weeks. She knew the material the way she knew her own name, not because she was extraordinary, but because she had spent 8 months writing it down carefully, and the days since reading it over in the dark. Ruth's statement took 3 hours. Elizabeth wasn't in the room for it. She sat in the outer office with William and listened to the low, steady sound of Ruth's voice through the wall, not the words, just the rhythm of it, even and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had been rehearsing this for 11 years and was finally in the room where the rehearsal ended. When Ruth came out, her face was very still. "All right," Elizabeth said. "Fine," Ruth said. Then after a moment it was strange, saying it out loud to someone who was writing it down. She looked at her hands. It became real in a different way. "That's the point," Elizabeth said. Aldridge came out behind her. He looked at all three of them with the focused calm of a man who has just received a great deal of information and is organizing it in real time. "I'm sending the letter to Garrett today," he said. "I'm also filing a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office regarding the Merritt Land and Survey Company and the specific parcels implicated in Miss Carter's records." He looked at Elizabeth. "The assessor's notice against you, I'm filing a response today that effectively contests its authority. Fitch tries to escalate, he's going to run into a territorial wall." "How long until Garrett?" William asked. "He'll receive the letter in 4 days. He'll act within the week after that, assuming the material is as significant as it appears, and it is." Aldridge looked at Elizabeth. "Go home. Keep a low profile. Don't go into Harlan Creek unless you must. If Holt sends anyone to the ranch, don't engage, send word to me immediately." He paused. "And whatever you do, don't let Holt get you into a conversation. He's very good at conversations." "I know," Elizabeth said. "I worked for him for 8 months. They rode back to the ranch the same afternoon. 3 of them now. Ruth had nowhere else to go, and nobody had suggested she go there. The ranch appeared around the last bend, the way it always did, and Elizabeth felt the same thing she'd felt before, that settling, that particular relief that she still didn't have the right word for. The children were in the yard. Samuel had apparently been in the process of explaining something to Clara involving a stick and a rock that had a logic she couldn't follow from this distance. Hector met them at the gate. "Quiet while you were gone," he said. "One rider came past on the second day, just passed on the road. Didn't stop." He looked at Elizabeth, but he slowed. "Holt's man," Ruth said, without looking up from unhitching her horse. "Most likely," Hector said. He looked at Ruth with the careful neutrality of a man who had been told the situation and had made his own assessment. "Mrs. Holt." "Ruth," she said. "Ruth," he said. That was all. The days that followed had a double quality ordinary on the surface. The meals and the chores, and Samuel's elbows and Clara's improving braidwork, and underneath it the persistent awareness that somewhere in this territory a letter was moving toward a man named Garrett, and somewhere in Harlan Creek Cornelius Holt was managing his empire without yet knowing that the ground under it had shifted. Elizabeth kept working. It was the only thing she knew how to do with anxiety: give it direction, give it tasks. The ranch was in better shape than it had been. The pantry was organized. The chairs were solid. The loose flue was fixed and the stove drew clean. She'd started a proper inventory of the winter supplies, which William had looked at, and then looked at her with an expression she'd seen before, the one that meant she'd done something he'd needed done and hadn't known how to ask for. Ruth was quiet in the house. She helped where she could. She was good with the children, patient with Clara's questions, unbothered by Samuel's noise, in a way that suggested she had some experience with households louder than this one. Night, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and sometimes a book, and Elizabeth would find her there when she came down early in the mornings, and neither of them said much, which was fine. On the 8th day, after the statements, Holt came. He didn't come with Briggs. He didn't come with riders. He came alone, in his good livery rig, and he pulled up to the gate at mid-morning on a clear day when the light was exactly what Roy had always said it was different from anywhere else, particular to this valley. Elizabeth saw him from the window. Her first thought, which she did not share with anyone, was, "He knows." Not a guess she could see it in the way he sat in the rig. He'd been a man who commanded his posture the way he commanded rooms. This morning the posture was controlled, but barely, with the effort visible at the edges. She went to the door. William was already moving from the barn. Hector had come around from the side of the house. Ruth had appeared at the kitchen window and then stepped back from it, which Elizabeth noted. Holt climbed down from the rig. He was dressed well. As always, he understood the authority of well-dressed in contexts where authority was being contested. He looked at Elizabeth on the porch, then at William, who had stopped about 10 feet away, then back at Elizabeth. "Miss Carter," he said. "Holt," she said. He looked older than she remembered. Not much, it had only been a matter of weeks. But something about the composure she'd always associated with him had developed a hairline fracture, something visible only if you'd spent 8 months watching his face closely. "I think we should talk," he said. "About what?" He looked at William, with the particular look powerful men give to people they want to exclude from conversations without explicitly saying so. "Alone," he said. "No," Elizabeth said. Something moved in his face. He adjusted. "I received a communication," he said carefully, "from a colleague in the capital, regarding a complaint filed with the Territorial Land Office." "I see," Elizabeth said. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Holt said. His voice was very even, very controlled. The voice she'd heard him use in business negotiations. The voice that meant, "I'm being reasonable now, but I have other modes available. The records you've apparently provided to an attorney are incomplete. They don't show the full picture. There are context and explanations for those transactions that would make the situation considerably clearer. Then you can provide those explanations to the territorial marshal," Elizabeth said. A pause. "Miss Carter." He took one step toward the gate, which was still closed between them. "You're an intelligent woman. You know that what you're doing has consequences. For you, for the people you're." He looked at William. "For everyone involved." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "I expect it does. I'm prepared to resolve this quietly," he said. "Your wages. Back wages. The full amount, with an additional settlement. A written statement from my office, restoring your professional reputation in the county." He said it like an offer, like it was generous. "All I need is the ledger. And whatever other documents you may have shared with your attorney." It was so close to what she'd expected that she almost would have been disappointed if he surprised her. "No," she said. He looked at her. "Miss Carter." "The ledger is in Thomas Aldridge's safe in Millfield," she said. "Copies are already in the mail to the Territorial Marshal's office. The family whose homestead claim you had Gerald Fitch erased the persons. Those documents are included." She kept her voice level. "There is nothing you can offer me that changes what's already in motion." Holt stood at the gate. For a moment he was very still, the stillness of a man who has just recognized that the room he walked into is not the room he thought it was. Then he looked past her. Ruth had come to the door. She'd come to stand behind Elizabeth, slightly back, not pushing forward, just present, and she was watching him with the particular expression of a woman who had made a decision 11 years too late, and was standing inside that decision now with both feet. Something happened in Holt's face that Elizabeth had never seen there before. Not anger, she'd seen anger. Not contempt, she'd seen that too. This was something older. Something that had to do with the specific pain of being looked at by someone who knows you completely and has stopped being afraid of you. Ruth, he said. Cornelius, she said. The word had no particular edge to it. No performance. It was simply his name, said by someone who knew what was behind it. He stood at the gate for another moment. Elizabeth could see the calculation happening. She'd watched him calculate in business meetings and in county disputes and in the quiet moments in his study where he thought no one was watching. She could recognize the process. Running through options. Looking for the angle. There was no angle. He looked at Elizabeth one more time. His eyes went to the porch, the house, the yard where Hector was standing, with the particular stillness of a man who has been very still in hard situations before. He looked at William, who was simply there 10 feet away, hands at his sides, not threatening, not backing away, just occupying his space on his own land, with the quiet stubbornness of a man who had been doing difficult for 2 years, and was not afraid of it. Holt turned back to his rig. He climbed in. He picked up the reins. He did not say anything else. He turned the rig and drove back down the road toward Harlan Creek, and Elizabeth watched him go the particular straight back of a man who is performing dignity, who cannot let the posture go even now. She watched until the rig was gone around the bend. Then she let out a breath she'd been holding in some form since September. William came to stand beside her at the gate, not touching her, just there. That's it, he said, not like he believed it was, just like he needed to hear the answer. No, she said, that's not it. He's going to try something else. But she looked at the empty road. He came to negotiate. He came to offer me wages. That means he's already talked to a lawyer of his own, and the lawyer told him the filing with the land office was real, and he came here because he thought he could still contain it. She turned to look at the house, at Ruth still in the doorway, at the ordinary morning around them, the barn, the fence, the sky clear and cold, and that particular Montana light falling across everything. Can't contain it anymore, Ruth said, from the doorway. He'll go to Fitch. He'll try to use the county channels to slow things down. Yes, Elizabeth said, which is why Aldridge filed the response to the assessor's notice yesterday. Fitch is already insulated. She looked at Ruth. We move faster than he does. Time. Ruth nodded slowly. Behind her, from somewhere inside the house, came the sound of Samuel's boots on the kitchen floor, and then Clara's voice, saying something sharp, and then Samuel's voice defending himself with considerable feeling, and then something that was probably a chair not breaking, just scraping, Samuel's elbows finding their radius. Elizabeth looked at William. Someone should go check on that, she said. Probably, he said. Neither of them moved immediately. I'll go, Ruth said, and turned back into the house with the quiet efficiency of someone who had found a use for herself and was going to use it. Elizabeth and William stood at the gate in the morning light, and the road before them was empty, and the house behind them was full of the ordinary noise of people living in it, and the territory was moving slowly, officially, irreversibly, toward the reckoning that had been building, since a man threw a ledger into the dirt and turned his back. He'll come back, William said. Yes, Elizabeth said, but not the same way. She turned from the gate and walked back up toward the house, and William walked beside her, and the screen door slammed Samuel, inevitably, and the day continued in the way days did. The work was not finished, but the shape of the ending was visible now, the way the valley was visible from the ridge, not close, not easy to reach, but there, real, something you could walk toward with both eyes open. Garrett arrived on a Tuesday. He came with 2 deputies and no fanfare, which was, Elizabeth would later think, exactly right for a man whose entire professional value was in not being noticed until it was too late to prepare for him. She didn't see him arrive in Harlan Creek. She wasn't there. She heard about it from Aldridge, who sent a rider to the ranch that same afternoon with a note that said simply, "Marshal Garrett is here. He has reviewed the material. It is enough. Stand by." She read the note at the kitchen table. Then she set it down and went back to the bread she'd been making. Because bread still needed making, and the dough didn't care about territorial marshals. Ruth was at the table, across from her, mending a shirt of Samuel's that had lost a fight with a fence post. She looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "It's enough," Ruth said finally. "That's what he says." Ruth looked back at the shirt. Her needle moved in and out of the fabric with the focused patience of someone who has learned to do something useful with her hands when her mind is working somewhere she can't follow it. "I thought I'd feel more," she said, when it started. "I thought it would feel like something breaking open." "What does it feel like?" Ruth considered. "Like waiting for a bone to set," she said. "You know the worst part is done, but it still has to heal." Elizabeth kept working the dough. Outside, Samuel was helping Hector with the afternoon fence check, which was code. For Samuel was walking alongside Hector, asking questions, while Hector checked the fence. But that was a form of help, too. Against Frozen, as Clara was somewhere in the house, quiet in the way she was quiet when she was thinking about something she wasn't ready to say. William came in at 5, and she told him. And he read the note and handed it back and said, "Good," and went to wash up for supper. Because that was what William Dawson did with news, absorbed it, named it, and continued. It had taken her a while to understand that this wasn't distance, the opposite of distance. It was someone who had decided to trust outcomes without demanding to control them. She thought, not for the first time, about what he'd said in the boarding house. "I'd rather be in it than out of it." She put the bread in the oven. Garrett summoned them to Harlan Creek 3 days later. Not to the county assessor's office, to the county courthouse, which was a different building, a federal structure, with a different chain of authority entirely. Aldridge had arranged it, which meant Aldridge had been busy in ways the note hadn't described. When they arrived, Elizabeth and William and Ruth in the wagon, Hector driving because William's hands were needed for something else he couldn't name yet. Courthouse was quiet on the outside, in the way buildings are quiet when something significant is happening inside them. Garrett was a compact man in his 50s, with a gray mustache and the kind of economy of movement that comes from decades of work where wasted motion costs something real. He shook their hands in order Ruth first, which Elizabeth noticed and filed away as information about the man's reading of the situation. He had already reviewed everything. The meeting was not, as she'd half feared, another accounting, another session of explaining and justifying and being believed tentatively and provisionally. Garrett had read the material. He had drawn his own conclusions. He needed 3 specific clarifications from Elizabeth about the merit entries, 2 from Ruth about the letters, and then he sat back and looked at them both and said, "Gerald Fitch was served this morning." Ruth's hands went still in her lap. "And Cornelius Holt," Garrett continued, "has been formally notified that his land claims on the North Ridge and the 2 mining parcels are suspended, pending a territorial investigation into fraudulent survey documentation." He looked at Elizabeth. "The assessment notice against you has been withdrawn. Aldridge filed the contest 3 days ago, and Fitch," a slight pause. "Fitch did not contest it, which tells you something about how clearly he understood his position by that point." Elizabeth sat very still. "Your wages," Garrett said, "from your employment at the Holt Ranch. The amount owed 8 months at the agreed rate will be recoverable as part of the civil proceedings. That takes longer, but it's documented. You'll see it." "I don't need it right now," Elizabeth said, which was not entirely true but was true enough. "You'll see it," Garrett said again, with the firmness of a man who has decided something. He told them the process from there, the territorial investigation, what it would involve, what their roles in it would be, what they could and couldn't expect in terms of timeline. It would not be fast. These things were never fast. Holt had resources and he would deploy them. and there would be attorneys and filings and counterclaims and the long grinding machinery of official process working on a problem that hadn't been created overnight and wasn't going to be dismantled overnight either. But the machinery was moving. It was moving in the right direction. And the people who had been paid to make it move in the wrong direction were, this morning, being served papers in their offices by a federal deputy who was not in anyone's county pocket. They drove back to the ranch mostly in silence. Somewhere past the halfway point, Ruth said, the persons. Is there any, can they? Aldridge said their claim is part of the land investigation, Elizabeth said. Whether they can reclaim it depends on where it's gone since and what the territorial court finds. She paused. He said he would try to find them. Ruth nodded, looked at the road. They had a garden, she said. The Pearson woman brought seed all the way from Minnesota. Specific kind of bean her mother grew. She told me about it once in the general store. She was quiet. I thought about that garden a lot over the years. Nobody answered that, because there was no answer that was adequate, and they were all old enough to know it. The next weeks moved the way consequential things move not dramatically, but steadily with the weight of real process behind them. Garrett's deputies were visible in Harlan Creek in a way that a county assessor's rider had never been federal authority, carrying federal gravity, which was a different thing from local influence. Fitch resigned from the deputy assessor's position within 10 days. He didn't go quietly, but he went. Holt fought. Of course he fought. He retained attorneys from Helena, hired, Elizabeth heard, at considerable expense, who filed 4 separate challenges to the land office complaint and 2 challenges to the admissibility of Ruth's letters. He sent a letter to William specifically, through an attorney, not to Elizabeth, suggesting that William's title to his own land was under review for reasons unrelated to the Holt matter. Transparent piece of intimidation that Aldridge dispatched with a letter so specifically legal and so specifically accurate about what constituted retaliatory harassment that Holt's attorney, by Aldridge's account, didn't respond to it at all. The intimidation lost its teeth the moment you named it clearly. That was something Elizabeth had begun to understand, not just about Holt, but about that class of power in general. It worked in proportion to how much it could stay unnamed. The moment you said the word out loud, in a document, with a date on it, it became something a person could respond to. She wrote all of this down, not in the ledger that was Aldridge's now, officially entered as evidence. She started a new one, a different kind, not transactions, but notes, what she'd learned, what the process looked like from the inside. She wasn't sure why she was writing it. She wrote it anyway. Clara found her writing in it one evening. "What's that?" Clara asked. "Notes," Elizabeth said. "About what?" "About what happened. How it worked." She considered. "So I remember it correctly." Clara sat down at the table across from her. She was 10 now. Her birthday had passed in the middle of all of it, and they'd had cake that Elizabeth had made, and Samuel had declared the best cake produced in this territory, which was an assessment not entirely undermined by his evident intention to have a third slice. "Will you forget?" Clara asked. "I hope not," Elizabeth said. "But I've found that if you don't write things down, the parts that were hard get softer than they were. And if you're not careful, you start to believe that things were easier than they actually were." Clara thought about this. Why does that matter? Because if you forget how hard something was, you might not recognize the same kind of hard when you see it coming the next time. Clara looked at the notebook, at Elizabeth's handwriting, which was small and precise in the way of someone who had spent years making records count. "Can I read it?" Clara asked. "When you're older," Elizabeth said. Clara accepted this with the maturity she'd been developing in the last 2 months, the maturity of a child who has watched an adult handle something difficult and has absorbed, through simple proximity, some understanding of what difficulty actually looks like, as distinct from what she'd previously imagined difficulty to be. "Elizabeth," she said. Are you going to leave when it's all done?" Elizabeth set down her pen. She looked at Clara across the table, this girl, who asked the questions that mattered, who had asked that question the first time weeks ago, who had accepted then that I want to stay, was not the same as yes. No, Elizabeth said. Clara looked at her. That's different from before. Yes, Elizabeth said. It is. What changed? Elizabeth thought about how to answer honestly, not in a way that simplified things, not in a way that made it sound easier or cleaner than it was, because Clara was not a child who needed things made easy, and she deserved honesty over comfort. I stopped treating this place like somewhere I was passing through, she said, and started treating it like somewhere I lived. Clara was quiet for a moment, turning this over. Hector says that's the hardest thing, she said. He says a lot of people can work somewhere. Not a lot of people can belong somewhere. Hector's right, Elizabeth said. He usually is, Clara said, with the frankness of a child who has accurate opinions about the adults around her. Don't tell him I said that. He'll get smug. Elizabeth almost smiled. I won't. Clara got up and went to find her brother, who was in the yard conducting some experiment that involved string and the barn cat, and Elizabeth sat alone at the kitchen table, with her notebook and the lamp and the sounds of the ranch settling into evening. She thought about belonging, about what it meant, practically not as a feeling, exactly, but as a practice, because she'd had feelings about places before. She'd had feelings about the house in Ohio where she'd grown up, and about the life she and Roy had started building before the fever took it. Feelings weren't the same as belonging. Feelings happened to you. Belonging was something you built, deliberately, with repeated daily choices, and it looked less like an emotion, and more like the decision to fix the loose screw on the cast iron handle, and reorganize the pantry, and learn which way the light came through the kitchen window in the morning. It looked like staying. The formal hearing at the county courthouse happened 6 weeks after its arrival. It was not a criminal trial that would come later, and separately in the territorial court. This was the land office hearing, the formal proceeding on the fraudulent surveys and the suspended claims. Elizabeth was called to testify. Ruth was called to testify. Aldridge managed both of their appearances with the focused competence of a man who had been preparing for exactly this. Holt was there. She hadn't been certain he would be. She'd half expected him to send his attorneys and absent himself, the way powerful men sometimes did when they wanted to preserve the illusion that the proceedings weren't entirely about them. But he was there, in the second row behind his attorneys, in a dark coat, with his particular composed posture, and when Elizabeth took her seat to give testimony, she was aware of him the way you're aware of a weather system, not looking at it directly, but knowing its position. She gave her testimony the way she'd kept her records, clearly, sequentially, without editorial. She explained what she'd documented, when and why, and she answered the opposing attorney's questions with the patience of someone who knows the material better than the person questioning her and isn't frightened by the performance of aggression. The opposing attorney asked, at one point, whether she had any personal grievance against Cornelius Holt. He accused me publicly of theft I didn't commit, she said. He withheld 8 months of wages. He arranged for the county assessor's office to file a notice designed to intimidate me into surrendering documents that were legally mine. She looked at the attorney steadily. Those are grievances. They don't change what the numbers say. Attorney moved on. Ruth's testimony was quieter than Elizabeth's. Lower voiced. She spoke about the letters with the specificity of someone who had read them. So many times she'd memorized passages without intending to. She spoke about the Pearson family. She spoke about the pattern of transactions that she'd observed over 11 years and documented in her own records. She was not dramatic. She was precise, and precision, in a room full of people who had been promised dramatic, had its own force. Elizabeth watched Holt during Ruth's testimony. He looked at his attorney's notes on the table in front of him. He didn't look at Ruth, not once. Whether that was strategic or whether he simply couldn't, she didn't know, and she found, somewhat to her surprise, that she didn't particularly need to. What mattered was that Ruth was speaking. After 11 years of knowing things and saying nothing, in a room with a federal seal on the wall and a recorder at a side table, and a hearing officer who was writing everything down. The hearing lasted 2 days. The result came the following week. The land claims were formally suspended. The Merritt Land and Survey Company was referred to the Territorial Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. Gerald Fitch was cited for abuse of official position, and Cornelius Holt was formally notified that the North Ridge parcel and both mining claims were under federal hold, pending the outcome of proceedings that would take Aldridge estimated the better part of a year to complete. His empire didn't fall overnight. That was not how these things worked, and anyone who expected otherwise didn't understand the architecture of what he'd built. But the architecture was cracked now, visibly, officially, in ways that couldn't be repainted or papered over. The men who'd kept their distance from Elizabeth on his instruction began quietly to stop keeping their distance. Tom Purcell at the general store found her eyes when she came in. The woman named Addie, whose husband worked Holt's land, came to the ranch one afternoon and sat in the kitchen and didn't say much and didn't need to. The town wasn't apologizing exactly. Small frontier towns didn't apologize as a rule the cultural machinery, for it wasn't well developed. But it was adjusting. The way communities adjust when the power that organized them shifts. When the person everyone had decided was the dangerous one turns out to have been the one telling the truth. Elizabeth's wages arrived in March. Not in full, the civil case was still moving, but the first portion, released by the territorial court as a preliminary determination in her favor, came through Aldridge and arrived at the ranch as a bank draft that she held in her hand for a long time at the kitchen table. 8 months of work, paid. She hadn't let herself think about what it would feel like. She'd told herself it didn't matter, that the wages were incidental, that what mattered was the records and the hearing and the process. That was mostly true. But standing in the kitchen with the bank draft in her hand, she felt something shift in her chest that was not about money. It was about something money could represent, the acknowledgement that the work was real, that the time was real, that she had not made it up or misremembered it or lost it the way it had briefly seemed she might. The work was real. It had always been real. The paper just made it official. Ruth came to stand in the doorway. She'd been living at the ranch for 4 months by then, in a quiet arrangement that nobody had formally defined, because defining it seemed unnecessary. She helped. She was capable and patient, and she knew how to be in a household with children without taking up more space than she needed. Talked to Aldridge about her own situation, what she was entitled to, what the proceedings meant for the property in her name, what her legal position was as a woman whose husband was under federal investigation. Aldridge had given her clear information. She was not without resources. The account in her own name at the Millfield Savings Bank had been earning interest for 11 years while she'd been deciding when to use it. "What are you going to do?" Elizabeth had asked her once, on one of the early mornings over coffee. "I don't know yet," Ruth had said. "I've spent so long thinking about leaving that I haven't thought about what I'd do after." A pause. Maybe that's the thing about being trapped somewhere. You use all your imagination on the leaving and none on the after. "You'll figure it out," Elizabeth said. "I know," Ruth said. "I just thought I'd be younger when I had to." Now Ruth stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the bank draft, and said nothing. "Thank you," Elizabeth said. Ruth looked at her. "I didn't." "Did," Elizabeth said. "Without your letters, without your records, the Merritt entries alone weren't enough. You know that." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to let me in," she said. "You didn't know me. I showed up at a gate with a tin box and no reason you should trust me." "You'd been sitting at that gate since the days before," Elizabeth said. "You came back. That's not a reason to trust someone." "Start," Elizabeth said. She set the bank draft on the table and looked at it for one more moment. Then she put it in the notebook. She'd been keeping the one with her notes about what had happened and how it worked. And she closed the notebook and put it on the shelf where it would stay. Spring came to the valley in the way it always did, not gently, not dramatically, just steadily. the way seasons change in Montana when you've been there long enough to know that they do. The grass came back. The mornings got lighter earlier. Samuel's elbows found new fences to test. Clara's braids got consistently better, to the point where she'd begun experimenting with something more complicated that she'd seen in a magazine and was refusing help on principle. William planted the kitchen garden in April. He'd never planted one before. He said this without embarrassment, in the same way he said most things as a fact about his life that was neither an apology nor a complaint. He said he thought he'd try it, and he went to the general store and spent a long time looking at seed packets within seed packets with the focused uncertainty of a man applying himself to an unfamiliar problem. And he came back with more varieties than one kitchen garden reasonably needed, and planted them with the same serious attention he gave to everything. Elizabeth helped him, not because he needed help exactly, but because it was the kind of task that was better with two people, and because standing in the dirt together with seed packets and slightly contradictory ideas about row spacing was, she'd come to understand exactly how two people who were being careful with each other made progress. "You're putting those too close," she said, about the bean rows. "I followed the directions," he said. "The directions assume the soil is different from this soil," she said. "Give them more room." He looked at the directions, looked at the row. "How do you know about Montana soil and beans?" "Don't, specifically," she said. "But my father had a kitchen garden for 30 years, and the principle's the same." He moved the seeds, didn't argue. They worked down the rows in the morning light. The valley was spread out beyond the fence line, the wide, easy expanse of it that Roy had been right about. The light really was different here, particular to this longitude and elevation, in a way that was difficult to explain, but obvious once you'd been in it long enough. "I want to ask you something," William said. She kept working. "All right." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was making sure he had the words in the right order. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "I didn't want to ask it while things were, while everything was still unsettled. It seemed wrong to ask questions like this while you had something bigger you were dealing with." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was not looking at the seeds. He was looking at her with the direct, slightly uncomfortable honesty of a man who has prepared something and is aware that preparation only takes you to the edge of the moment and then you're on your own. "I know you stayed because you had nowhere to go," he said at the beginning. "I know it started as a practical arrangement. I'm not pretending it was something else." He held the seed packet in both hands. "But I also know it didn't stay that way. For me, and I think maybe not for you either." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to answer for the kids," he said, "or because the house runs better, or because of any of it except the one actual reason." He stopped. "I would like you to stay. Not as the person who manages the household." Stopped again. "I don't know the formalist way to say this that doesn't sound like a contract." "William," she said. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said, plainly. "That's what I'm asking." The kitchen garden was quiet around them. The seeds were in the ground, and the morning was clear, and the light was exactly what it always was in this valley. She thought about the road north. The road she'd turned onto because she couldn't make herself go south. Because going south felt like giving something to Holt she wasn't ready to give. She thought about the wagon coming, the sound of wheels that needed grease, a boy watching her with something that looked like hope. She thought about burnt biscuits and a broken chair and a ledger pressed against her ribs for weeks, and Aldridge's office, and Ruth at a gate, and the county courthouse with a federal seal on the wall and a bank draft in a notebook on a shelf. Thought about Roy. About what he would have said, and about the fact that what he would have said, if she was honest, was go ahead. That he'd been gone 3 years, and she'd been living in the meantime, and living was the point. He'd been practical about the things that mattered. He'd have been practical about this. She looked at William, at this man who had stopped a wagon for a stranger on a road and offered her work when the word the world wanted to use was charity, and had fixed the bridle while she went to find the ledger, and had stood at the gate when Holt came, without positioning himself in front of her, and had planted a kitchen garden with too many seed varieties because he'd tried to solve the problem by covering every option. Not perfect, not a man out of a story, not someone without rough edges or silences that went too long, or the habit of going to the barn when his feelings needed somewhere to go. Real, consistently, stubbornly, quietly real. Yes, she said. He let out a breath. You were worried, she said. I'm always worried, he said. That's just how I am. I know, she said. It's all right. They finished planting the garden. That evening, Clara figured it out before anyone told her. She had the particular radar of a child who has been paying careful attention to the adults around her for months. And at supper she looked between Elizabeth and her father twice, and then said, with the directness she'd apparently decided was her primary mode of operation, something happened. Eat your supper, William said. Something good, Clara said. You look different. Clara, he's right. You do look different, Samuel said in the tone of someone contributing objective, reporting to a situation he hadn't yet interpreted. Elizabeth looked at William. William looked at Elizabeth. We're getting married, Elizabeth said. Clara set down her fork. Samuel looked at his plate, then at Elizabeth, then at his father, then back at his plate, processing this with the 10-year-old's particular method of handling large information, which was to first determine whether it was good or bad, and then figure out what it required of him. Clara said, I knew it. You did not, Samuel said. Absolutely knew it, Clara said. I've known for weeks. You have not? I notice things, Clara said with enormous dignity. I'm observant. You didn't say anything, Samuel said, because I was waiting to see if they'd figure it out themselves, Clara said, and they did. Eventually, she picked up her fork. Took a while, but they got there. William looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who loves his children completely and is occasionally entirely at their mercy. Elizabeth laughed. A real one, the kind that came from somewhere low in the chest, the kind that arrived when something was actually genuinely funny. She hadn't laughed like that in longer than she could precisely remember, which was maybe the point. She'd been so focused on what she was carrying that she'd forgotten what it was like to put it down. They married in May in the county clerk's office in Harlan Creek, with Hector and Rosa and Aldridge as witnesses, and Clara in a dress she'd pressed herself, badly but determinedly, and Samuel in a collar that he'd worn for approximately 45 minutes before it somehow became incompatible with the back of his neck and had to be loosened to the point of irrelevance. Ruth was there too, standing slightly to the side with the expression of someone watching something happen that they are glad to witness and have no need to claim a part of. It was not a grand occasion. It was a Tuesday. The county clerk had 3 other appointments that afternoon and was professionally pleasant in the way of people conducting the 4th ceremony of their week. There were no flowers except the ones Clara had picked from the field that morning and stuck in a jar on the windowsill, which were wildflowers and slightly wilted by the ceremony but present. Elizabeth wore a dress she'd made from fabric she'd bought at Tom Purcell's general store, where Tom had insisted giving her a better price than the ticket said, and had done it without making a speech about it, which was the right way to do it. She held William's hand during the ceremony. His hand was calloused and not small, and she was aware of it the way you're aware of things that are real solidly, practically, without needing to name it as remarkable. They drove back to the ranch afterward. No different from any other drive back. The valley the same, the road the same, the mountains the same shape they'd always been against the sky. 6 months after the hearing, the territorial court issued its formal findings. Cornelius Holt was found liable for fraudulent land survey operations and assessed significant financial penalties. Criminal proceedings separate, slower, resulted in a conviction on 3 counts of fraud the following spring, which carried a sentence that his attorneys managed to reduce but could not eliminate entirely. The empire didn't collapse in one moment. It eroded, the way things erode when the structure they're built on is no longer concealed quietly, steadily, parcel by parcel, claim by claim, until what remained was something small enough to be accurately understood. Gerald Fitch left the county. Nobody mentioned where he went. Pearson family was found in Oregon. Their original homestead claim on the North Ridge was restored in part, not all of it, the law being imprecise in ways that frustrated Elizabeth when she read Aldridge's summary. But enough that it meant something. Aldridge wrote to them and sent the determination, and 2 months later, Ruth received a letter addressed to Ruth specifically, which meant Aldridge had told them about her involvement from the Pearson woman. And Ruth read it at the kitchen table and set it down and said nothing for a while. She says her mother's bean seeds, Ruth said finally. She still has them. She's been growing them in Oregon. Elizabeth looked at her. She says she's glad someone spoke, Ruth said. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. That's all. She just said she was glad. Ruth left the ranch in the fall. Not because anything had changed, she simply came to the point where she'd recovered enough to know what she wanted to do next. And what she wanted to do next involved the money in the Millfield account and a small house she'd identified in town, and learning what it was like to live inside choices that were entirely her own. She said goodbye to the children, who extracted various promises about visits, and to Hector and Rosa, and to William, who shook her hand with real warmth. She said goodbye to Elizabeth last, in the kitchen on a morning that had the quality of endings not sad exactly, just weighted with the awareness that something was completing. You know where I'll be, Ruth said. I know, Elizabeth said. If you need me, I know, Elizabeth said again. Ruth nodded. She put her coat on. She picked up her bag smaller than the one she'd arrived with because she'd left some things behind for the children. Book for Clara, and a particular jackknife she'd had since her own childhood that she'd pressed into Samuel's hand and said he'd better take care of it, or she'd know. She walked out to her wagon. She climbed up with less stiffness than she'd had in September, either because the months of living in a real house had done something for her joints, or because she was carrying less than she'd been carrying when she arrived, which was probably both. Elizabeth stood at the door and watched her drive away. The road took her to the left, and then she was gone around the bend, and the ranch was quiet for a moment, in the way places are quiet when someone who'd been in them has left. Then Samuel's voice from the barn, Hector, I told you I can do it. And Hector's voice, patient, not arguing, yes, but watch the left side. And Clara, from somewhere upstairs, singing something to herself she'd probably deny. She was singing if asked. And William's hand, briefly on Elizabeth's shoulder, as he came to stand behind her in the doorway. She leaned back slightly, just enough to feel that he was there. Outside, the valley was in its autumn colors, the grass gone gold, the hills behind it deepening toward brown, the sky that particular high clear blue that Montana produces in October, like a final argument for itself. The light fell across everything the way it always did in this place, different from anywhere else, particular, specific, belonging to nowhere else in the world. Roy had been right about that. Roy had been right about most of the things that mattered. She stood in the doorway of the house she lived in, the house she'd arrived at with $40 in a ledger and no plan, and she thought about what it meant to build something, not construct it. Not plan it from the beginning, but build it the way you build most things that last, which is piece by piece, in the middle of everything else, not knowing when you pick up each piece that it's going to be part of something that holds. The loose screw on the cast iron handle, the pantry that made sense, the chair legs that didn't wobble, the morning braid, the garden with too many seed varieties, planted in properly spaced rows, beginning to come up green. There was a word for what happened when you stayed somewhere long enough to fix the things that were broken and learn where the light came in and know which door would stick in wet weather and which child cried quietly and which one broke things with his elbows by accident, and how to tell the difference between a man going silent because he was thinking. The word was home, not a place you found, not a thing you were given, a thing you built with repetition and attention, and the daily decision to be present in it, until one morning you woke up and it was simply true you were somewhere. You belonged. And you had made it so. Society, and no one could take it back. Elizabeth Carter, Elizabeth Dawson. Now, though she still thought of herself by both names, because you didn't stop being the person who walked the road just because you'd arrived somewhere, stood in the doorway of her home in the Montana Valley, with the autumn light falling, exactly the way it always did, and let herself have it. All of it. She'd earned it the hard way. Those are usually the things that stay.